Welcome, everybody. I'm Vanessa. I'm from Chicago, and I'm a physician who has been in recovery for about 5 years now. And I'm going to share today a system that I discovered when I took my coaching course. I'm now a She Recovers coach, and it's called Internal Family Systems. And I came across internal family systems. I'm going to share my screen with you right now. So I came across internal family systems when I took my Crossroads Recovery coaching course. And internal family systems is something that really resonated with me. And I then delved deeper into it by taking an internal family systems coaching class and studied some classes, took some classes with Richard Schwartz, who was the founder of internal family systems in the 1990s. And then actually found myself an IFS therapist and did some of my own work that I found to be extremely healing. And it really spoke to me in terms of the addiction perspective. And Richard Schwartz describes, actually, I'm going to go back here for a moment, describes how he actually, I love the story of how he found internal family systems. And he just talks about how he was working with a client who was cutting herself, and how she would describe various parts of herself, the part that cut and the part that really hated the part that cut. There was the part that cut and the part that was afraid of the part that cut. And he talks about how he was working with this client, and one day he was really desperate, and he was talking to her and begging and pleading with the part that cut to not cut. And she agreed not to cut herself. And lo and behold, she comes back the next week, and once again, she's cut herself. So he talks about how he went to this place of deep compassion and curiosity and really started asking that part, what was it that motivated her to cut? And what was she afraid would happen if she did not cut? And through these powerful questions and from this place of compassion, he found the part started to unburden, is what he describes it. The part stopped doing its extreme behaviors. The part was heard, was seen, and integrated into the system. So Richard said that, and that's how he came up with the idea of internal family systems. And he said, even the worst impulses and feelings, the urge to drink, the compulsion to cut oneself, the paranoid suspicions, all spring from parts of a person that themselves have a story to tell and the capacity to become something positive and actually helpful. The point isn't to get rid of anything, but to help the parts transform. So what he says is that the human mind is a complex of interacting parts, each with a mind of its own. And what it is, it's like an internal family that we all have within ourselves. And this family, and that's where the idea internal family came from, that the family has got the wounded children, the angry teenagers, there are critical parents, and then there are nurturing friends. And what's really crucial to understand about the system is that all of the parts are welcome, right? They all are there to do something good for us, and we're never trying to get rid of any of our parts. That is not the goal here. What we're really trying to do is help these parts integrate into our system. We want to actually help them release from their extreme roles. So we want to allow the cutter not to cut anymore. We want to allow the part that binges not to feel the urge to binge anymore. And the way we do this is through the healing work of the internal family systems guidance. And I'm going to explain that to you more and give you a sample of that as we go along. What we do, and we do this from a place of self-leadership. And I know that doesn't make sense right now, but I'm going to explain what self is in a moment. But the way we do this is from self. So our parts are divided into two different types of parts. We have our protectors, and our protectors are those parts of us that are trying to prevent us from feeling pain. And they're divided into two different types of parts as well. We have our managing protectors, and I'm going to explain this all, and our firefighter protectors. And then our exiles are those parts that hold our pain, right? So we have protectors that prevent us from feeling pain. Our exiles are the parts that they are trying to protect because they are the parts that hold our pain. So let's talk about the managers. So once again, managers are protectors, and they are parts of us that keep us looking good. They prevent our wounds from getting triggered, and people usually like them. So examples of managers would be like your caretaking part, or your perfectionist part, an inner critic part, a conflict avoider, right? A people pleaser. And these parts work really hard. They are working to keep the pain away, and they're working extremely hard. And when we get to know them and we actually do the work of IFS and we ask these parts, you know, what they want to do, they want to take a rest. They don't want to work as hard anymore. They've been doing this for years and they're tired of doing their job. Now the firefighters. The firefighters are the parts that come in. They're also managers. So they're not managers, they're also protectors. They are trying to also prevent us from feeling pain, but they react when a wound has been activated. So they come in and they're there to put out the fire. They're very extreme in their response. They'll come in, they want to extinguish uncomfortable feelings. They want to get rid of painful thoughts. They want to get rid of painful memories, images, uncomfortable body sensations. And they're not rational, right? Managers are very rational. Firefighters are very impulsive. They're quite destructive. And their behavior will often result in criticism from a manager, which then triggers the cycle of destructive behavior to repeat. So for example, the binge part, you know, may get a lot of, which is a firefighter, may get a lot of criticism from an inner controlling part. And then that results in a lot of shame, and the whole behavior, the cycle gets repeated over and over again. So the types of parts that the types of behaviors that firefighters have then are addictions, binge behaviors. They can exhibit themselves as violence or anger sometimes, self-harm, obsessive thinking can be a firefighter type of part, dissociation or suicidal thoughts. Now our exiles. Our exiles are these young and vulnerable parts of us, right? They carry our wounds, they carry our hurts, our burdens, our trauma. They are stuck in the past, right? So sometimes they are pre-verbal and they're in our implicit memory. Sometimes our exiles will appear as flashbacks or as nightmares. And exiles start to emerge when the system becomes overwhelmed, or an event or a trigger or a person can trigger them. So it could be a smell. It could be a certain person who looks a certain way can trigger an exile. And what happens when the exile is triggered, when the wound of the exile is triggered, the system then relies on the firefighters to come right in and manage the chaos, put out that fire, put out that pain really fast, use the binge behavior, use the alcohol behavior, whatever it is, harm oneself, anything to get rid of the pain. Now, when we get to know our exiles, what we find with exiles is what they really want is they want to feel loved and cared for. And when they are unburdened, we find out that they really are these really young, joyful, creative parts of us. They want to play. They want to have fun. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the self, because I said I would come back to self. The work of IFS has to be done from the perspective of self. And so what is self? Self is like the seat of consciousness. The self is the wise, deep, strong, loving part, loving. It is who we are when we are not being hijacked by those painful, defensive voices of our parts. And it's important to understand the self is not a part, right? It is what observes the parts. It's what can hold the parts, but it is not a part. And what Richard Schwartz said, and what was very, really struck me about the self, is that it has intuitive healing properties. When you are in self, you know what you need. You know how to heal yourself. And it is always available to us. The challenge is in getting there, right? And being able to get to self. And it's also known as the spiritual self for some. Some define it as the spiritual self. Now the self, Richard Schwartz talked about the 8 C's of self. And you don't have to have all these 8 C's to be in self. But if you want to know or check in, am I in self? You have some of these. You're in a place of feeling calm. You feel connected, confident, compassionate, curious. There's clarity. You can feel courageous and creative. So there are some of those are present when you're in self. Now in IFS, a big part of what we do is a process called unblending. And I'm going to guide you through about a 5-minute or so meditation or practice in a moment so you can get a sense of what this looks like. But unblending is the idea that whoever resides in your seat of consciousness at any given moment is in charge of our psyche. So a part is blended with yourself, the self, when you're flooded with the feelings of the part, right? In a way that you're not grounded. So when you're flooded, say, with your perfectionist, you are coming from the beliefs of the perfectionist, and you are coming from that is in charge of your psyche. The perfectionist is in charge. And when you're blended with a part, you are not separate enough from it to get to know it, to witness it, right? So we have to be able to separate a little bit from our parts in order to actually work with them and to get to know them. We cannot be blended with them. So we have to do this from a place of self. And we do this by asking the parts to separate a little bit and allow us some space so that we can actually get to know them. And this has to be done from that curious, compassionate place of self. So once again, unblending occurs when you create space between you and the part you want to get to know. And it can be used, and I teach people when I work with them and I'm doing IFS work, I'm teaching them during the day, check in and see, are you blended with your perfectionist? Are you blended with your inner controller? Are you blended with, who are you blended with? And if you are, you can ask that part, would you mind stepping aside just for a moment? Give me some space so I can get to know you, so I can understand where you're coming from. And that's sort of part of the work we do by ourselves individually when we're using this work in our lives. So what I'm going to do for a few moments now, maybe about 5 to 6 minutes, because I think I have until about 1:30. Is that right, Dawn?
Or a little over.
Okay, great. I'm going to guide you in a meditation now, which is giving you a sample of what it's like to start to get to know a part. And this is a very abbreviated version of it, but it's just so that you can get an idea of what it actually looks like in a session if you're working with a therapist or a coach who does this work. So what I want you to do, if possible, is if it feels comfortable to you, you can close your eyes. Otherwise, you can go ahead and just leave your eyes open and gaze on the ground. And take 3 deep breaths in and out through your nostrils just to bring you here. And notice the connection of your body with whatever surface it's in contact with, and how it's supporting you in this moment. Make an intention to get to know a part today. And I want you to bring to mind a part of yourself, a manager part. So perhaps one of your inner critics, maybe a perfectionist part, or maybe a controlling part, or a people-pleasing part, or conflict avoidant part, some part that you want to get to know. And think about the last time this part was really active. Remember a situation when this part was active. And checking in, see where you find the part in your body. How do you feel the part in your body? How do you know that part is present? Do you hear the part? Does the part have a certain voice? Does it have your voice? Or do you see the part? Does it have a color, or does it look like somebody, or does it look like you? And if the part is close to you, see if you can ask it just to separate a little bit, to step aside and give you a little space so that you can get to know it. Now check in with yourself and see how you feel towards that part. Do you feel curious or compassionate, or perhaps do you, if another feeling is coming up, a feeling of maybe fear or anger or irritation with the part, then another part is present. Then a part that's trying to defend you, or maybe an exile is present. And if that is going on for you, ask that part if it would mind separating so you can get to know the part you want to work with today. And now check in again and see how you feel towards the part. And if you do feel compassionate or curious, then you're ready to get to know your part. If not, then you can just follow along, or choose this other part to get to know. So ask your part what name it wants to be called. And check in and see how old it is. Ask it how it got its job. How good is it at its job? Does it like doing its job? If it were not doing its job, what would it rather be doing? Is there anything else that it wants you to know? Ask this part what it's protecting you from. What is it afraid would happen if it stopped doing its job? Now let the part know. You will come back and get to know that part that it's trying to protect, and thank this part for what it has been doing to try to protect you and look after you, and how hard it has been working for you. And then you can come back to the room. So that's just a very abbreviated version of how we do a very short session. It's usually much longer than that. But what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about the inner critic, because that's a part that causes all of us a lot of trouble. And it's a manager part that attacks you, right? And makes you feel bad about yourself. And it doubts you, it undermines you, it tells you what you should and shouldn't be doing, it tells you who you should and shouldn't be, tends to talk in kind of harsh and punitive ways to you. And the inner critical voice really forms during our early life experience, and it stems usually from internalized attitudes that were directed to us by our parents or our caregivers. And sometimes it also stems from the internalized negative thoughts that our parents had towards themselves, or our caregivers had towards themselves, and we picked up on that. And it's there to protect us, right? It has good motivation. It wants to protect us from rejection. It wants to protect us from judgment. It wants us to get attention, admiration, approval. It wants also to prevent us from doing things that are harmful to us. And it wants to keep us safe from being attacked, right? And there's Jay Early is a man who's done a lot of work in internal family systems, and he has a website, and I wrote it down here somewhere because I thought you might want to go. It's called personalgrowthprograms.com. And on this website, he has a quiz that you can take to look at which type of inner critic is more active in you. And because he's divided these critics into 8 different types of inner critics. So there's the Taskmaster, the Perfectionist, the Inner Controller, the Underminer, the Guilt Tripper, Destroyer, Conformist, Doubter, and everyone has a variety of these. Some are much more active in some people than others. So I'm going to tell you just about a few of them. The Taskmaster, that's one that's very active in me, pushes you to work hard, judges you if you aren't working hard, calls you stupid or lazy, tries to motivate you to be successful so you won't be rejected or have any failure. And often what you find is it's polarized with a procrastinator. So there's the Taskmaster trying to make you push you hard, and then it's polarized with a procrastinator who wants you to sit on the couch and not do anything, and it causes a lot of discomfort internally. Then many of us probably have this, the Inner Controller, which is that part that controls your behavior rigidly. So it's trying to prevent you from behaving impulsively. It doesn't want you to overeat or drink or show anger. And the way it does this is it uses shame. And this is always in a battle with an impulsive part, right? It's in conflict with that. And then the perfectionist part, which is trying to get you to do everything perfectly. And the problem with the perfectionist is that it sets these unattainable, unachievable, demanding standards. And for some people who are perfectionists, it's hard to start tasks. And for others, it's just hard to complete tasks because they're just never good enough. And it has this idea that it's there to try to make sure you fit in and that you'll never be rejected. And then there is the Destroyer. This is a really, really painful inner critic. It is an inner critic that makes pervasive attacks on your fundamental self-worth. It shames you. It makes you feel inherently flawed and not entitled to basic understanding and respect. And usually this critic comes from early life deprivation and trauma. It's really motivated by the belief that it's safer not to exist. And the last one I'm going to talk about is the Guilt Tripper. This one is one that's stuck in the past. It's really unable to forgive you for wrongs you've done or people you've hurt. And it tends to, what it does is it makes you feel bad about certain things you haven't done. And it's concerned about relationships and holds you to standards of behavior that are prescribed by your community, your culture, and your family. It really wants to keep you connected and make sure you belong to your tribe. And it's trying to protect you from repeating past mistakes by making sure you never forget and you never feel free. It's constantly guilting you. Now, the criticized child is really the part that holds our wounds and burdens. And the whole thing, the whole inner critic is around trying to protect us, protect the criticized child. And in IFS work, when we get to know this criticized child, what we do is we do these 3 parts. First, we go back to a moment in time. We go back and we get to know an event where the child was criticized, or remember an event where the child was criticized, and all from the perspective of self, right? And when we do this, we then we reparent that child. So the self can then allow the child to say the things the child needs to say to the parent, and also hear the things the child wished the parent had said to them. So that's the reparenting process. The second thing we do is we retrieve the child. So the criticized child is living in the past. They're living at the age of 5 or 7 or 3. And what we do is we help the child come back, and we retrieve the child from the past and bring it to the present, to some safe space that is in the present. And the child, the self decides where that safe space is. And then the last thing we do in the process is we unburden this child. And this is like a healing ritual in which we ask the child where they want to release their wounds to. And it's to earth, water, wind, or fire, or wherever they choose. And they get to choose and release. And this is an incredible internal ritual of healing for the child at that moment. So the last thing I'm going to just share for a moment is about the inner champion. And the inner champion supports us and helps us feel better about ourselves. And the inner champion is something that Jay Early came up with, and he describes it as the ideal supportive parent you always wished you had. It responds in a helpful way to our inner critic attacks, and it helps you see the positive truths about yourself instead of the negative lies from the inner critic. Now, the champion is something that we can all cultivate and develop. And there are practices that we can do to do this. And there are all types of different self-compassion practices and other practices that we can do to help cultivate the inner champion. It helps you take charge of your inner life, and its roles can be to nurture you, so that your inner champion can tell you things like, I completely accept you no matter what, I care about you, you've accomplished many valuable things in your life. These are the kinds of mantras or affirmations your inner champion can tell you. I appreciate your qualities and capacities. You are already everything you need to be. And it also has a very important role in setting boundaries with the critic. So when your critic is really active, your inner champion can come in and say, your judgments are not helpful. Now is not a good time for this. Please step aside. Your attitude is causing me problems. I know you want to protect me, but your approach is not working. These are the types of things that we can cultivate in our inner champion, and inner champion can do this for us and work for us. So this is kind of an overview of how, and it's a very brief overview of how we can work with the various parts and allow them to integrate into the system. And then we can heal the inner child, or the inner exile, or the inner criticized child. And some people have a number of them. Some people only have one. Some people have many different inner criticized children and need work on a number of different parts of themselves. So I'm going to just leave you with one quote by Robert Kiyosaki, which is, it is not what you say out of your mouth that determines your life. It is what you whisper to yourself that has the most power. I'm going to leave it there, and I'm happy to answer questions on anything that's coming up for anybody today.
Oh, thank you, Vanessa. We'll just chat for a couple of minutes, and then I'll turn off the recording and open it up for Q&A and comments. I kind of was trying to turn it over to you, but first I had wanted to introduce you more formally, but I gave you the wrong cue, and so you jumped in. So I apologize for that. But I do want everyone here to know, if you don't already know Vanessa, Vanessa is a retired physician, a certified life and recovery coach. She took her training at Crossroads Recovery School, which is where I also trained. And she's accredited through the International Coaching Federation, holds a BA from the University of Chicago and an MD from the University of Illinois at Chicago. She trained as an endocrinologist at the University of Chicago and practiced in endocrinology in private practice for 22 years. As a physician and mother of 3, Vanessa balanced the demands of a career and family under the stress and anxiety until the stress and anxiety became overwhelming. She turned to poor coping mechanism to escape the demands she places on herself and came into recovery in 2015. Since then, she has been building her coaching practice. Please do, I will share again. I have already shared her website, but you will find her at Resilience Recovery Coaching. Vanessa brings non-judgmental acceptance and a deeply compassionate demeanor, as you can tell from her presentation today, to meet her clients where they are in their process. She strongly believes that each client has a unique journey and works with her clients to discover their own path. She holds her clients accountable for the commitments they make to change and helps them move forward in their lives. Her passion is to guide others struggling in their lives to find a place of balance, to disconnect from their inner critic and reconnect with their inner wisdom. So thank you, Vanessa. That was incredible. You know, I was saying to Vanessa just as we started off this morning, before everybody joined us, that the last time I really ever worked on and looked at internal family systems was when I took it also in my coach training. Vanessa, can you give us a little bit of idea of, because there's a difference between this type of inner child or inner critic work that we might do with a therapist versus the work that we might do with a coach. And for me, I would, you know, if I was to explain it, I would say the difference is that a coach is going to teach you how to do this work with yourself, and that a therapist will, you know, actually take different modalities and dive into the same type of work, only in a different therapeutic setting. Is that, am I describing that right? Is the difference between, you know, coaching people to use it themselves versus leading them through some other therapeutic, potentially related process to get here?
Yeah, so I don't know that that's exactly the difference, Dawn. I think that, and I'm going to actually be presenting this to some therapists next week. And I think that the big difference between working with an IFS therapist versus an IFS coach, because I think an IFS therapist will as well work with you towards using this in your own life, is that, and I really see the big difference is that I would not work with someone who's had significant trauma. I think a therapist should be working with someone who's had significant trauma in their past, abandonment issues that have significantly impacted their lives. So I'm not going to work with a client who's had that and has not had the support of a coach at the same time, a therapist at the same time as working with me. But a coach can work with someone, do IFS work with anyone who's had like critical parents, or, you know, being criticized or picked up, you know, dysfunctional coping mechanisms. But I think that to me is the biggest difference.
That's great. And I think, you know, we always make the distinction that recovery coaches we stay in our lane in terms of we're not therapists. So we don't, you know, it's not the same. So I think that that's great. We'll be doing the same presentations, only instead of doing them in She Recovers Together, we're going to try out doing them out in public on our Facebook page. So you're certainly welcome to join us as we stream this. There will be an opportunity to ask questions through the Zoom webinar that we'll be using, as well as the Facebook page, She Recovers Facebook page.